So, first thing I want to talk about is energy-intensive industry, because it's going to be an issue where we expect some movement at the autumn statement. That graph there is energy costs over a number of years, excluding taxes. There's a reason why, and this is important. This is the government statistic which comes closest to capturing the true difference between British and other major European countries' policies. Because that excluding taxes number is more accurate for two reasons. Firstly, because our climate policies which drive up prices aren't counted as taxes. They're counted in the wholesale costs. Whereas other countries count them as taxes, but then don't charge those taxes to energy-intensive industry. So you get a more accurate picture of the true comparison, looking excluding taxes. The difference, according to the IEA, is 10 to 25% compared to Germany, we're paying more, and 60 to 75% compared to France. In Germany, it's because of substantial rebates on all of the major climate policies for energy-intensive industry. In France, it's because of a consortium called Excelsior, which deals with EDF, and it's a typically French solution, where they get lots of big companies to do special deals and give them very, very low and very, very stable long-term prices coming out of them, in return for very stable demand for all the nuclear output. What's the critical problem that the government has with policy at the moment is its carbon floor price is going to, by 2020, add 10% to that red British number and reduce all of the others. British government policy is going to reduce energy prices for industry across the rest of Europe because our carbon floor price increases the price here, thereby reducing demand. Reducing demand, everyone else is still getting the market price, reduces that market price. It's therefore not going to cut emissions, it will in fact increase them because it will drive some out of Europe. And within Europe, to the extent we reduce our emissions more, other countries will increase them faster. And we are actually sitting there saying, give us more of the burden of cutting greenhouse gas emissions. We feel, we have this masochistic desire to inflict greater pain on British industry. So what the government needs to do, and if that happens, it will mean thousands of lost jobs. It will mean, as well, I think it will undermine the effectiveness for revenue. The key question that we need to ask, if measures aren't sufficient on energy-intensive industry, is, will this raise the 1.4 billion the government's relying on it to do by the end of the forecast period? Because if you have revenue coming in from your carbon floor price, but on the other hand, another plant closed, like a Linemouth aluminium smelter that closed the other week, every one of those plants, there's VAT losses, income tax losses, national insurance losses. It will very easily outweigh that if you get substantial contraction in energy-intensive industry. Next one. I want to go through a couple of union pension myths, because the other thing we've got going this week is the strikes. The first one is this chart from the Hutton report. That chart is entirely accurate, and the unions are using it to say, well, the cost of pensions is going to come down, what's the problem? What they don't mention is that chart includes the switch from RPI to CPI, which substantially reduced cost, and they are striking against. So what they're saying is, make one of the major changes, we're going to strike to protest, and this system will be substantially more affordable. Absolutely. But they can't have it both ways. It's really important that don't let unions get away with, on the one hand saying pensions are affordable using evidence based on a change, and the other hand saying it would be outrageous if you switch to the inflation measure. One or the other. Because if that inflation measure doesn't switch, then that graph just goes up. And that's been confirmed by a number of studies. There are other problems in there that relies upon the workforce in the public sector growing at 0.25% a year in order that you have more contributors. If it is in fact contracting that workforce, then you have, as this is what we've looked at in our research today, you have more and more people who are receiving pensions, fewer and fewer paying into them, so it gets worse. Equally, if real earnings don't rise at 2% a year, if productivity doesn't rise at 2% a year, if for all of the reasons people have talked about today, growth doesn't turn out the way it's expected to, then as a percentage of GDP, those costs will be higher, and again, that won't work out. However, the most fundamental and immediate challenge for those numbers, if the unions are going to cite them, which they have been endlessly, is they've got to, in that case, accept the switch to CPI, because that's what that's premised on. Next slide, Chris. How generous are public sector pensions? It's another figure we hear endlessly, is the average pension is around £5,000, £6,000. Complete nonsense. That average is the average of anyone who's got a public sector pension. Someone can work for just a couple of years and get a public sector pension, which won't be worth very much. The question isn't what's the average, which can include, it's like, what's the average, lifetime public sector earnings, and you include someone who might have, had an appearance fee from the BBC once. We are talking here, have to be talking about what is the normal pension. That's what people expect from reporting on this. What's the normal pension someone can expect after a career in the public sector? And we know those figures. We don't need to do averages or estimations there. We know them. We know that if a middle manager in a council retires on £60,000 after a 30-year career, he'll be getting a pension of £30,000 a year. We know that an NHS worker retiring after 30 years on £40,000 will get £15,000 a year plus a £45,000 lump sum. We know that a teacher who retires on 50k after 30 years will get £25,000. Therefore, this £5,000 figure that is being cited is massively misleading compared to the normal entitlement someone will rack up with a career in the public sector. It may be that someone does only work a couple of years in the public sector. Their public sector pension will therefore be quite mean, but presumably they will be, or should be, also therefore building up another pension elsewhere. Yeah. I think it's entirely possible they may even be building up other public sector pensions, and they still won't be counted in this calculation. So we just need there are just a few facts which the unions are throwing around endlessly, which they need to be called on, because the opinion polls suggest at the moment people trust a lot of what they say. And they shouldn't when they're citing statistics like this. So it's important they're properly challenged on some of the empirical claims they're making. So the final thing I wanted to do is just talk very quickly about growth and some of the measures we've specifically heard about recently. The infrastructure fund, £5 billion is a genuine shift from current to capital expenditure this Parliament. That, to the extent it reverses what had been capital-heavy cuts from the very first, from the last government's plans, is probably growth boosting, in that generally cuts to infrastructure will have more of an effect on growth. The 20 billion from pension funds, the critical question is what will they be investing in? If this is a PFI style, dressing up of the national accounts, I don't think it's that meaningful. I don't think it's that positive. If, on the other hand, we're talking here about income-generating assets and a genuine investment in infrastructure, and it has to be something like airports, but that's not going to happen. It's not that. It's about as far from shovel-ready as you can get. It's wonderful and all about airport investment, but it's going to come well after 2015-16, particularly if you're talking about the Isle of Grain. Third runway, you might be able to get some movement more quickly. That's the only way you can get a shovel-ready airport substantially. The other option is schools. Now, it may be more free schools, but again, there are institutional bars for substantial expansion there. It could be reinstating some of the old Schools for the Future projects. But that's not going to be a substantial scale. That has to come out of that £5 billion initial. I don't think they're going to be able to channel the pension fund money in there. And the final £5 billion to make up to the 30 is the next Parliament. And that's a joke. I mean, that's just Osborne saying, I think whoever does my job after me should probably put some money into infrastructure. It is absolutely meaningless. The meaningful number there is the £5 billion switch, and then the 20 billion if they can find projects for them to put the money into. Other growth measures, in terms of that long-term growth Andrew was talking about, there's tax. Now, cuts, I think what Mike said there about the expenditure target is absolutely critical. Credible plan on spending, and international research shows introducing those even partway through a fiscal adjustment makes fiscal adjustments more effective and boosts growth. Tax also looking at simplification, but we've seen plans on national insurance and income tax which are underwhelming compared to the initial hype. We're talking now not just about alignment rather than a merger, but alignment as a multi-parliament project. So where you've had the ambitious fundamental reform not on the agenda at all, we have the more modest reform over a very substantial period of time. And then finally on regulation, I think we just need to look to the main areas. I mean, we should mark well on health and safety. Energy, I've spoken about earlier. Planning, I think it's going to be a challenge making planning work for growth now, because I don't think planning is actually a big limitation now. But there are opportunities here, but I think so far the government haven't found them. because on tax in particular, there's been a lack of ambition.